Hi everyone and welcome to the video presentation for Module 22. This module will be talking about the voice leading for secondary leading tone chords, and we'll also talk about how to complete figured bass exercises with the chords we've been talking about, which are secondary function chords. So our objectives for this video are to learn how to resolve secondary leading tone chords and how to complete figured bass examples with secondary function chords. So quickly, we'll talk about the voice leading for secondary leading tone seventh chords. And so remember, these are the chords that are the leading tone chord, the 7 diminished chord, and they sometimes have a 7, of a note that you are tonicizing. And so just like secondary dominant chords, the 5/7s of something, these tonicize a note, and they also have all the same notes as a regular 7th chord. So the same rules apply. The 7th of the chord needs to resolve down, and the leading tone needs to resolve up. The only difference is that the leading tone will be the root of the chord, not the third of the chord. So since these are the leading tone chords, they're the 7 diminished in the scale, the root of each of these chords will be the leading tone. That doesn't necessarily mean that it will be the lowest note, but that does mean that it's the root of the chord. So we'll always be resolving our roots up a step, and our 7ths down a step. And another way to think about it is the 7th of the chord resolves down and the leading tone resolves up. And in that way, it's exactly the same as our 5/7 chords. Okay, so here's an example in the key of C major. Now, when you go through these things, you want to be trying to find the 7th of the chord and the leading tone of the chord. Since this is in root position, this is an F sharp diminished 7 chord, and this is actually half diminished. And the leading tone will be the F sharp here, and the 7th will be the E. So we found the 7th and we found the leading tone. We know that the 7th needs to resolve down by a step, so that E needs to resolve down to become a D in the next chord. And I will draw that on the correct line. And the F sharp, the leading tone, needs to resolve up to become actually the root of the next chord. And then that A and that C can move by step, and they could both sing the B if needed. And this would give us our G major chord, which has a leading tone of F sharp. That's how we know that that F sharp leads to G. And we know that in the key of C, that G chord is called the 5, which is what this is the leading tone of. So this is our correct completion of that chord. Okay. So again, we're just finding the leading tone, finding the 7th, and resolving them appropriately, just like we did before. Let's look at a couple examples in 4 voices. All right, so now we're in the key of G, G major for the first one, G minor for the next one. What we want to do first, of course, is probably analyze the chord, and then think about what chord would follow that. So let's put this chord in root position. We have a B as our lowest note. Our next note will be the G sharp. I'll put that up here. Next note up will be an F. I'll put that here. And our next note up would be the D. Now that is not in root position. So what we need to do is rearrange it so that it is in root position so we can analyze it and we know what these notes are. So that G sharp, in order to get into root position, would move down an octave. So we'd have G sharp, B, D, and F. And it's actually an F sharp according to the key signature. So our chord is a G sharp, half diminished, 7th chord. That means that the G sharp is the leading tone, so we know how that needs to resolve. And the F sharp is our 7th, so we know how that needs to resolve. Well, let's analyze this. If this chord is a G sharp, half diminished 7th chord, then it's the leading tone of the chord that it needs to lead to. And so G sharp is the leading tone of A, so the chord that needs to follow this will be an A chord, and in the key of G, that's going to be an A minor chord, so that'll be a 2 chord. So we know that the Roman numeral for this would be a 7, half diminished, and the third of the chords on the bottom, so this is a 6/5 of 2, and then the next chord would be a 2. Okay, from here we just resolve all the notes as they should resolve, the leading tone going up, the 7th going down, and we've already identified those. So here's our leading tone. Let's resolve that up to A. And here's our 7th. Let's resolve that down to E. The rest of my notes should be in an A minor. I should have another A, and I should have another a C. So I can move my B down to an A to become root position, and I can move the D up to a C, or down to a C, to become the 3rd of the chord, and that's the correct resolution of this chord. All right, so that's how you would resolve that chord. Now let's do the same thing over here. First, we want to put this in root position, or analyze it. So let's put all the notes up here. So our lowest note is a B natural. I'll put that up in the treble clef. And I'll put the natural next to it. That's going to be important. My next note up is an F. I'll put that up here. My next note up is a D. And my final note up is an A flat. So this actually is in root position, so we don't need to do any rearranging. And I can see that this is a B fully diminished 7th chord, because we have B natural, D, F, and A flat. Those are all minor thirds, so that makes it a fully diminished 7th chord. The root is B, and the root's always the leading tone. So this chord, since B is the leading tone, B is the leading tone of C. So this is going to want to go to a chord that has C as its root, and in the key of G minor, that's going to be a C minor chord. So this will be going to a 4 chord, since that's C minor. So we can say that this is a 7 fully diminished, and this is in root position, so we can go ahead and write 7 of 4, followed by a 4. Okay. From this point, you could find all those parts of the chord. So the leading tone is actually the bass this time, since the root is in the bass. And then the 7th is the note A flat, so that's all the way up here in the soprano. So those are the 2 things we need to worry about and resolve correctly. So let's do that. Start with the leading tone. The leading tone in an outer voice, of course, needs to move up to the note that it is the leading tone of. So this is the leading tone of C. So that B natural leading tone needs to resolve up to C. The 7th needs to resolve down by a step. So that A flat will go down to a G. Everything else can move by step, avoiding parallels and things like that. You have all kinds of options. Let's move the D up to become the 3rd of the chord. And our G could move up to a G there. Now, this is not parallel fifths because we have a tritone here and then a perfect fifth. So that is actually not perfect fifths, so we are okay there. All right, so then that is the correct, or one of the correct resolutions of that chord. Okay, great. So that's what you do. You analyze the chord, figure out what the chord is, then you decide how to analyze it, and then also that tells you which chord comes after it. After you figured that out, you identify which voice has the leading tone, which voice has the 7th, resolve those correctly, and everything else will move to become the correct notes of the chord that follows it. Okay, so let's look at our next thing, which is how to handle these figured bass examples for secondary function chords. So we've kind of been dealing with these in isolation. Now we have to do these chords in a figured bass. So the first thing you want to know is how to identify these secondary function chords when you have a figured bass. And often accidentals, either in the bass line itself or written below the bass notes, will tell you that it's a secondary function chord. Okay? So for example, we're in the key of B minor here. It's 2 sharps. We could look for notes that do not belong in B minor. So this chord here says that it's a 7 with a sharp a third above the note that's here. So that's going to be a chord that is C sharp, E sharp, G, and B. So that is a chromatic chord there. So that's going to be a secondary function chord. This would be a 5, 7 of 5. Okay. Now, this here would actually be an F sharp we'd have an A sharp above this chord, and we'd have a C sharp as well. And that looks chromatic, but that A sharp actually does belong in the key of B minor. It's the leading tone of the key. So in that case, that does not indicate a secondary function chord. So sometimes that sharp, especially if you're in a minor key, does not indicate a secondary function chord. So you have to be careful. You always have to analyze it and make sure that you have the correct accidental, and asking yourself, is that something that just happens in minor, or is it actually indicating a secondary function chord? So you always have to be aware of the analysis. All right, now here in this chord we have a D sharp in the bass, but we don't have any accidentals in the numbers. So this has the potential to be a secondary function chord. So if I looked at the rest of these notes, I'd have a D sharp, an F sharp, an A, and then a B. And that is a B7 chord, which does not belong in B major and B minor. So that actually will be a secondary function chord. That's a 5, 6, 5 of 4 in this case. Okay. Over here we have another sharp, but again, that's just an A sharp. So that's not a secondary function chord. And then over here we have sharp 6, and the sharp 6 above C sharp is just another A sharp. So that A sharp is the leading tone, again, of B minor. So then this is not a secondary function chord, it's just a regular old 5 chord. So sometimes the accidentals tell you that it is a secondary function chord, but sometimes they don't. So you always have to be, you have to be able to analyze them first and figure out what they are. Okay. The good news is you can get pretty far in this stuff without really worrying about the analysis if you just follow the numbers that are below the bass line. So what I'm going to do to complete this is I'm going to first write the soprano. It should always be your first step. So composing the soprano. Then I will identify the secondary function chords. And then I will complete the rest of the voices. And I think to save time, I'm just going to focus in on the secondary function chords. So soprano, analyze secondary function chords, complete alto and tenor. Okay. So let's just focus on the soprano first. Now we're in the key of A major, and we want to follow the same principles we always have, which we're emphasizing things like contrary motion between the bass and the soprano, and also oblique motion, and avoiding things like parallel fifths, etc., and then following the numbers that are below the bass line. Okay? So what's the first thing we could do? Well, we can't move up to a D because D is a fifth above G, and we're not allowed to have a fifth in this chord. We can only have a 6, a 4, and a 2. So I think in this case, the best thing to do is to have oblique motion, since we can't have contrary motion. So we'll repeat our C sharp. Okay. Now, contrary motion with the bass would have that going down, and then, so that means our soprano should go up. So that C sharp should go up to a D, and we can have D in that chord because D is a 6th above the F sharp, so that's great. Then we want to hopefully have more contrary motion, so going up a step, and we can have that E because that's an octave. Here we have a 7, so this chord wants to have a 7th in it. And a 7th above E sharp is going to be a D, so, and the bass line moves up, so a good choice for our soprano would be to go down to a D to become the 7th. Now we know that that's the 7th of the chord, so we know that that has to do something, that has to resolve down. So we'll resolve that down to a C sharp, and we can have a C sharp in that chord because it's a 5th above F sharp. In this next chord, we have a sharp indicating that we should have a D sharp in this chord. And we could have our soprano go up to D sharp if we wanted to. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to have us go down to a B, which is an octave. In this next chord, we're going to go with oblique motion, keep the B, that's a 5th above E, that's fine. And then we'll resolve down by a step to become A. Okay, so we did our soprano, and we did it just by following the numbers and moving things by step and moving things in contrary motion. And if we came across something like a 7th, we were sure to resolve that down by a step. Okay, Now we want to find out where these secondary dominant chords are, and we want to look for accidentals and then confirm that those accidentals don't belong in the key, and then we will hopefully have found secondary dominant. So right off the bat we have a G natural, and G natural does not belong in the key of A because A should have a G sharp, so that's a chromatic chord. And let's figure out what this chord would be. So we have a G. Our next note up would be a second, that's an A. Our next note up would be a fourth, that's going to be the C sharp that we wrote. And then this also has a sixth in it, and so that's going to be the note E. So right now it's not in root position, so what we would do to analyze it would be to move that G natural up an octave. So we'd end up with A, C sharp, G natural. That is a dominant seventh chord. So this will be a 5-7, or sorry, 5-4-2, since it's an inversion of something. So what key, what chord is A7 the 5 of? Well, A7 is the 5 of D, and in the key of A, D is written as 4. So that's our next chord. And this chord is a 5-4-2 of that chord, so it's a 5-4-2 of 4. So that's our first secondary dominant chord. And we know how it should all resolve, right? The leading tone should resolve up. The leading tone of the chord is C sharp, and we actually already did that. So we already resolved our leading tone up by a step by following the correct contrary motion in the soprano. Our seventh should resolve down, and that's already done for us in the bass. So we're good. Everything else can just kind of fall in place. So we have a G, we have a C sharp, we also need an A, and we need an E. And we can get those from our previous voices. So our alto can just repeat the E, and our tenor can just repeat the A, and we've had great voice leading. Okay, now to get the next note, we could do it a couple different ways. That A can stay the same because that belongs in the chord 2. And then we have all the notes we need, so we have a couple different options. We could go up to an F sharp and double the third, or we could go down to a D. Both would probably work. I'm going to go up to the F sharp and just double it. So that's what I'll do. Okay. Now over here we have an E sharp, and an E sharp definitely does not belong in the key of A, so this will be a chromatic chord. And let's put this up here. So our lowest note is an E sharp. This chord should also have a third, even though it's not written, and it should also have a fifth. So a third above E sharp is going to be G. A fifth above E sharp is B. And then a seventh above E sharp is D. So our chord is E sharp, G sharp, B, and then D. So you can tell by the sound, it's a fully diminished seventh chord. This is an E sharp, fully diminished seventh chord. And it has all the same parts as a regular seventh chord or a secondary dominant chord. So we should find the leading tone of that chord in the seventh. But let's analyze it first. So if E sharp is the root of the chord, that's the leading tone of the chord that this is tonicizing. So E sharp is the leading tone not of F, but of F sharp. And in the key of A major, F sharp is the sixth. So we say that this is a 7, fully diminished 7 of F sharp, and F sharp is 6. And the chord that follows it is also a 6. So this is a 7, fully diminished 7 of 6. Okay, and then from there we resolve it. So our leading tone is E sharp, that's our bass, that's down here in the bass, and that actually already resolves up, so we're good, we don't have to worry about it. The seventh is in the soprano again, and that resolves down by a step, and we did that just by following our good voice leading. So often good voice leading will just be good. So our seventh was the D, that resolved down by step to the C sharp, so we're good. Now the other notes we could fill in. Let's say that we ended up on the B here, and we had a G in our alto. Well, these would all just kind of move to whatever is the closest, so we could have our G sharp go up to an A, that's a good choice. Our B could go down to an A as well, and we have all the notes that we need for that chord. Okay. Now this next one has a sharp in the bass, so let's see what this chord is. So my lowest note is B, put that up here. My next note up would be a D sharp, because that is in the chord. And then my next note up would be an F sharp. So with that D sharp, this chord does not belong in the key of A, so this will also be a secondary dominant chord. Now there's no seventh this time, but it's still a secondary function chord. And so since it's a major triad, we know that it is the 5 of something, and this is a B major chord. So B is the 5th note of E, so this is going to be the 5 of E, and in the key of A, E is going to be the 5th, so this is the 5 of E, also known as the 5 of 5 in the key of A. And the chord that follows it has the root E, so this is going to be a 5. So it's 5 of 5 leading to 5. Okay, now the only note we need to worry about in this one is the leading tone, since there's no 7th. And the leading tone of E is going to be D sharp. And so we need to find a place for that D sharp. And actually we kind of messed up, because there's really no place that we can have that can go to a D sharp smoothly, right? So like the alto, that's a pretty bad leap. And the tenor, that's also a pretty bad leap. So we kind of have to change what we did in these inner voices. But fortunately, the inner voices are not set in stone. You can do whatever you like with them, right? So we could have had maybe the tenor move up to a C sharp, and then have that followed by the D sharp, and that might be the best thing to do. That makes that D sharp stepwise instead of a leap. So that's probably the best way to handle that. Okay, now the alto could go down to an F, and that's probably a good way to do that. Now when we move to the next chord, that D sharp is our leading tone, so that needs to resolve up to the E. And we need a 3rd for this chord, so that alto could move to a G sharp, and that would be how you'd resolve that chord, that 5 of 5. Okay, now from here you could finish it out. Maybe what I'll do is I'll have my alto go down to an E, and my tenor could go to a C sharp, and I end up with that. So in that, from measures 2 to the end, it would sound like this. This is my 7 fully diminished 7 of 6. And there you go. Now the cadence, it's a 5-to-1 cadence, and the soprano ends on do, and there is no inversions. So this is a perfect, authentic cadence. Okay, great. A lot of information, but it was mostly me doing exercises, which I think is pretty helpful. So thanks for watching. We'll be talking about this more in class, and have a great day.